Welcome to City Cinematheque, where the art and pleasure of the movies are the subject of serious discussion. I'm your host, Jerry Carlson, and I teach film studies at the City College of the City University of New York. Today, it's our pleasure to screen the 1948 British production, The Fallen Idol, directed by Carol Reed. Based on a short story by Graham Greene, this is one of those films that makes up what critics now call the British tradition of quality. It was made while Carol Reed was at the height of his powers. You'll know some of the other films of his, such as Odd Man Out, Outcast of the Islands, and supremely, The Third Man. This film is about a young boy's perception of the relations going on about him and how it leads a whole host of people into trouble and perhaps out of trouble. We'll be talking about that and other subjects after today's screening. It's a pleasure to have back our old friend, Professor Leonard Court of the College of Staten Island of the City University of New York to discuss this and other themes. Now, take this opportunity to enjoy Carol Reed's The Fallen Idol. Hi, welcome back to City Cinematheque. I hope you've enjoyed this opportunity to see The Fallen Idol, a formerly magnificent film with extraordinary acting, and also, I think, a major example of what we said earlier the critics call the British tradition of quality. Here today to guide us to some of these issues is our old friend, Professor Leonard Court. Lenny teaches cinema studies at the College of Staten Island and at the CUNY Graduate Center. He is one of the editors of the magazine of Film and Politics, Cineast, and has for many years taught a variety of courses on British cinema at the university. And I think at the moment you're completing a book on Mike Leigh, one of the stars of contemporary British cinema. Lenny, let's talk a little bit about the moment, the general industry moment of this film. Late 1940s, post-war Britain. What is the British tradition of quality? I've used that phrase. And how does Reed fit into it?
Well, a number of British films, they probably have their precursors in the 1930s in court of productions like Rembrandt and Henry VIII and the literary productions, but they were a kind of body of literary cinema, usually from literary sources, that probably had its heyday in the post-war era. David Lean, Carol Reed, Anthony Asquith, Basil Dearden, and probably the two great figures were Reed and Lean. Lean's Brief Encounter would be one example. Oliver Twist and Great Expectations, also Lean's work, and Reed's Fallen Idol, Odd Man Out, and Third Man would be other examples.
Can I nominate one more, which is his Conrad adaptation that fits in the literary tradition, An Outcast of the Islands.
And Reed's Outcast of the Islands, a film which is rarely shown, actually.
And I think which is a shame, because it's in this moment in which we're getting a lot of Henry James and Joseph Conrad adaptations.
And Jane Austen.
Jane Austen adaptations. It'd be very nice to see, again, this adaptation. But
well,
I
think the point of these films were that they were very well mounted, very skillfully made. They were intelligent literary adaptations that carried sort of literary values. The dialogue was crisp, it was literate. At the same time, both Reed and Lean were visual directors. They were not, I don't want to make invidious comparisons, they were not Ivory and Merchant. They were people who had a kind of skillful sense of the use of the grammar of the cinema, of editing, of camera setups, of mise-en-scène, of composition. But the films had sort of reeked of quality. They had a sense of being very controlled works, very carefully crafted works. We could say that The English Patient, right, the recent great hit and possibly Academy Award winner, I don't know.
We'll find out, won't we?
Yes, this show will go on afterwards, I assume, is in this kind of sub-lean genre of a kind of literate, intelligent filmmaking that also can reach a very, very wide audience. These are films that somehow reach though one could also say The English Patient carries elements in terms of its complex narrative of Alain Resnais and people like that, of the French films of the late 50s, early 60s. But these are films that seem, maybe more than seem, extremely literate, extremely intelligent. that they're worthy of the attention of an educated audience, that they convey a kind of quality, a quality of cinema which goes far beyond the ordinary genres, the Western, the thriller, that they're saying significant things. At the same time, there's a limit, from my point of view, to the imagination, the cinematic imagination and personal vision of the directors working here.
Okay, before we get on to that, and then we can talk about some of the specific issues of this particular film, The Fallen Idol, which is certainly a major example of this formal command of the medium of someone like Carol Reed. Let's backtrack just a little bit to the social and industrial context of this tradition of quality, because up on the screen in these films there's a Britain that's somewhat at tension with the Britain that was the lived experience of Britons in the post-war era. I mean, this is a country of food rationing. This is a country devastated by bombings during the war. So I think there is this interesting notion of nation building, of rebuilding a reputation of the British, both literary tradition and of the British arts, of the solidity of the national character that comes out through the exquisite craftsmanship of these films, which is at a kind of significant gap between what the daily life, not even of the working class Britain in this era would be, but of the middle class and upper middle class Britain in this era, because of course the war had devastating not only human, but clearly it had devastating economic and material effects upon the country as well. So I see this as a moment of a national cinema very much engaged in regaining and maintaining a certain kind of national reputation for the country through the fact that we do things of quality in this kind of way.
I would agree totally. Of course, not only, and you do mention it, that working class life is usually untouched, at least contemporary working class life, post-war working class life is untouched. But of course, 48 means the triumph of the Labor government and Clement Attlee, and a real change, the nationalization of medicine, a whole shift in the nature of English educational life, English class life, English political life. And these films, of course, go nowhere near it. They remain, and there, look, in English cinema, there's been a recurrence of this. I think you did mention the Austen, right. E.M. Forster, the Irene Merchant are Americans, but they work in an English context in a way, which again, during the Thatcher era, reaffirmed probably an England that doesn't quite exist in reality, in this point in a pastoral, right. Upper middle class England. Yes, these films, I wouldn't call it quite escapist in the same way a Western or thrillers are escapist, but yes, contemporary reality, the contemporary realities which exist in English films by Ken Loach or Mike Leigh in the 80s right. and 90s are left untouched by Lean, by Asquith, by Reed. They are not involved in what one remembers from these films are particular images, particular camera angles, a certain kind of acting, a certain dialogue, but less of a kind of penetration into the particularity of English life.
Okay, now that's when we're getting now at what the theme that you were bringing up a little bit earlier, which is what are some of the limitations that you would name of this tradition or of some of these films. I think we can talk about that generally, and then we can sort of move on to how one can see that specifically in relationship between the Graham Greene short story upon which this is based and the film itself. But what do you see as some of the other kinds of limitations, whether they be thematic or formal, of this cinema?
I would say, for example, just talk about the film that was just shown, The Fallen Idol. Sometimes one begins to feel the repetition of effect. One feels that there are so many off-angle shots, there are so many subjective view shots, and one feels much of it comes more from the eye of the director, the cameraman, and a subjective view of the boy watching. One feels the masterstroke of a craftsman rather than the perspective of the boy. That Leigh, who is less interested in that kind of skillful camera setup, you know that you're entering into the perspective of the individuals rather than the perspective purely of a detached camera. And one is aware of the brilliance of the camera rather than the particularity of an individual perspective. And this, again, provides a kind of controlled reality.
Right.
One has rarely a sense, finally, of the tragic, of something that penetrates that. I always like Kafka's notion about art, that art should be like axe that destroys or subverts the frozen ice that we live with, the surfaces. The surfaces remain finally untouched in this kind of work. It is these works are the triumph of the surface over certain kinds of depth, and I'm fascinated by it because it makes the films both eminently watchable and worthy of respect. I think The Fallen Idol is a film worthy of respect, and that at the same time one remains deeply, I think, untouched intellectually and emotionally, one respects it aesthetically.
Okay, let's go from the angle of the Graham Greene, because of course this is one of the distinguished collaborations in the history of cinema of Graham Greene with Carol Reed. It gives us a film that we've shown here at other times on City Cinematheque, The Third Man. This is the film that they make after this one. What can you sort of illustrate about this? Our viewers may not have read this short story by Graham Greene, The Basement Room, but what are some of the differences that would illustrate the way in which there are certain things that one could do in a literary context in Britain that one could not do in a literary filmic context?
Well, in the Greene story, the boy's consciousness is much more central. There's less emphasis on Baines and almost no emphasis on the Michelle Morgan role, a girl called Emma, who's really utterly peripheral to the story. So the emphasis lies on the boy's consciousness and the boy being essentially overwhelmed and traumatized by this experience. The film gives us a sense of it, but really does not give us a sense of the profundity of the trauma. I'm thinking of a later film called The Go-Between,
yes.
albeit from a Hartley novel done by Joe Losey, which catches probably I don't say it's a better film, but catches more profoundly the sense of the trauma of that kind of experience. A boy entering into an adult universe which he doesn't quite understand, which overwhelms him. And the story, of course, ends differently, where he's essentially trying to lie. Not trying to lie about an innocent man, but try to lie about a guilty man.
Right.
And the man is guilty, and at the end, everybody, the man does not end up with, the Baines does not end up with the woman. The boy doesn't have parents coming home to achieve at least superficial closure. And I think the last sentences of the story gives us a sense that this has been a trauma that has traumatized him for life. This particular experience.
Let me backtrack just a little bit in literary history and say that Graham Greene, by his own admission, time after time, had several masters. I mean, people whom, as a young man, he admired a great deal, which included, of course, Joseph Conrad, who then Carol Reed is going to adapt a couple of years later. But standing next to that is somebody who's become enormously popular once again for cinema adaptations, and that's Henry James. This is in a certain way, this is almost a Jamesian kind of film. I'm thinking particularly of the famous novel by Henry James, What Maisie Knew, confined to a child's perspective, watching the machinations of the adult world. And I think that's another way in which these are people who are mining a literary tradition. I mean, they know exactly where they come from, and while this may be an original, it's a screenplay based on a story, there is a tradition that moves backwards and the people they admire, and trying to bring that sensibility to the screen. At the same time, I happen to be in agreement with you that the impact of this is different. There are things that James or Greene in his novels will do that they're going to shy away from here. Having said that, I think the ending of the film is really quite interesting because of you might, on one hand, say it's a kind of failed ending. But I'm not sure it's failed because I think one of the major strategies used by Hitchcock and used by others is the false endings. of this notion that, okay, you require certain kinds of plot mechanisms. We'll give them to you, but we're not going to give them to you in a way that's going to make them credible. We're not going to, we can make other things in this work credible in a very strong way, but this ending is not something we're willing to invest our creative or narrative energies in making credible, because there are a lot of things that I think, for example, the question of what is the enduring effect of this upon the child? The ending is so, in one sense, symmetrical that you say, well, wait a minute, symmetry cannot erase murder in some way, or a child's imagination that can deal with murder. What do you think about that?
I agree. I think, in fact, since we don't quite see the boy embracing the mother, and the boy is always at a remove and distance from many of the adults, there's a sense that it's all happened so abruptly and so quickly. I think we're left with a lingering sense, a subtext rather than a text, that the boy has been traumatized, that the boy keeps on speaking to the police about the murder and keeps on being rejected. That sense of being sort of repudiated and dismissed as ineffectual, as not understanding the world that he's dealing with, has to leave an emotional legacy, a traumatic emotional legacy. So there's a lot of pain in the film, and you're absolutely right. Those are endings made for sort of commercial reasons that are not quite, which any discerning audience would understand as much more right to the effect of that sequence. So I'm not saying it's utterly compromised. I don't want to say that. I'm just saying that there's even the butler, played by Ralph Richardson, is given clearly a much more sympathetic play in the film than in the story. He's maybe unable to act, be a touch impotent, but he's a touch futile. But there's an element of kindness, sensitivity, gentleness, which you get less of in the story, which makes him even feel shabbier.
Let's talk about Richardson from a slightly different angle, and that is the importance of acting and certain styles of acting to the British tradition of quality. I mean, what apart from what his character is, what do you think that somebody like Richardson, one of the notable great British actors of the 20th century, contributes to this, and how does the British acting tradition contribute to this tradition of quality?
Well, the British actors like Richardson or Olivier Gilgood, or whoever, or if we think of Great Expectations, Bernard Miles, or offer a kind of just a full understanding of the role, not quite naturalistic playing, not quite the playing that of Finney and Courtney and Richard Harris in the kitchen sink films, putative realist films in the 50s, in the late 50s and early 60s, which are a real break from the film of quality, though they too are literary adaptations, most of them, which is interesting enough. But if not naturalism, there's a kind of performance which is utterly controlled and extremely intelligent. You feel it's just an extremely refined performance, a performance where he's in utter control of this role that he's performing, and done where he just communicates with a few gestures, a few soft words, an absolute understanding of the situation, and a complexity which is not overtly expressed in the dialogue. And I'm utterly, one is just astonished by Richardson's performance. It's the strongest performance in the film. The woman, Michelle Morgan, has very little to do but remain very, very still and beautiful in sort of soft-focused close-up. But he remains the linchpin of the film. Right. And one can understand how a young boy would construct a kind of romanticized fantasy around the surrogate father that he has.
It's interesting because in what was actually his official biography, William Wyler talks about working with Ralph Richardson when they made the Henry James adaptation, The Heiress. And Wyler, by his own admission, was a famously inarticulate director. That is, he knew what he wanted when he saw it. And of course, he got great performances out of a whole host of actors and actresses, driving many of them to near madness in doing so, because he would always just say, not good enough, do it again, and just until he got it right, but not really giving instructions. And Wyler talks about working with Richardson and it being a completely different experience because they were taking a shot in The Heiress in which Richardson was to come through a door. And it was just, one of those shots that's supposed to take 30 minutes on a film set just to do this. And Richardson came through the door and he said, well, how do you want me to come through the door? Well, Wyler did not give instructions on people on how to come through the door. And he said, well, you just come through the door and I'll tell you when it's right. And Richardson said, well, we don't need to waste time doing that. Just sit down for a minute. And Richardson, by Wyler's account, came through the door in 6, 7, or 8 different ways, all within character and that. And he just said, so, which one do you want? and Wyler said that I'd never worked with someone that had this amount of control over nonverbal issues and who could give me this selection. And he said, I don't know, I can't remember whether Wyler said I want 3 or 4, but he said I want that one, and and did it.
I think one can see it in the film. One can see it just with the gesture of a hand, or his wink and little dance at the beginning when the boy looks over from the landing through the railing at him, just as a way of connecting with him as a pal father.
Right.
All sorts of subtle gestures that Richardson just engages in through the film, and the interesting sequence where they go to the zoo and he's trying to have a conversation with Michel Morgan, and the boy keeps on sort of intrusively calling him every 2 seconds, and the way he handles it or doesn't handle it, there's that smile, and of which prefigures the sexual act that follows it, when the boy asks what's going on between these animals, look, and they share a kind of collusive smile between them, the man and woman, and it's everything Richardson does. Without a Richardson, you wonder what kind of movie, with a cruder actor, with a less subtle actor, what this film would have looked like.
Well, one should point out that obviously in the second half, the film has a very strong investigative aspect to it as well, and a number of the actors who pop up in those roles, of course, our spectators will recognize as people who take major and prominent roles. I mean, in a certain way, perhaps most famously Bernard Lee, who shows up as M in the James Bond movies, but Jack Hawkins,
Dennis O'Dea.
Absolutely. And all of them bring this subtlety and this sort of non-hysteria to this situation. Everything is underplayed, yet we feel this tension that's going on within this space.
I was just thinking the direct difference between that kind of acting and the acting that in some ways follows it between Harris, Finney, and Courtney, and then of course American acting of the Pacino, De Niro, method acting or variations on method acting school, and this acting is just it's in the tradition of quality.
Right. Let's turn from that over to some of the genuine accomplishments of this film in terms of its style. I mean, you talked earlier about the way in which there is a slightly show-off quality to it, but let's forget that for the moment, okay? And let's say that all of this does serve our implication into the world of this young boy. Largely, what are some of the aspects of Reed's choice and manipulation of the range of cinematic possibilities? How does he create this? And because I think this is not a film that one forgets. There's a number of things about it that are memorable, that come not from the acting, that come not from the Graham Greene story, but that come from our placement in this world.
Well, it's a fantastically elaborate set. It's an embassy in Belgravia. He both uses location, very interestingly, and the indoors, where there's fantastically wide spaces between people and alienated space, and that helps fantastically. There's also different levels and layers to the building, where he works from floor to floor, from landing to shooting through the rails, through the banisters, through the rails on the landing, to the parquet floor on the bottom of the embassy, where the butler and either the butler and his insidious, destructive wife are, or Michel Morgan are, while the boy sits usually on the second floor looking out. The boy seems solitary, alone, at a remove from the world, and the only connection, the parents having left for, I think, the mother's illness, and the father going to pick her up, the ambassador, that the boy is utterly alone except for Baines. He doesn't seem to have friends, he doesn't seem to have connections, and it's all shot from his point of view, looking out constantly at Baines and looking out at the world, touching his head curiously, and with ledges with a window, with the windowsill which creates the accidental death for the wife, with elaborate balconies overlooking the street, with a back fire escape staircase creating the most labyrinthian of rooms. The butler living in a basement kitchen, which often happens in English large houses, where the
Upstairs, downstairs.
where the basement is often the servant's kitchen, or I remember in old bed and breakfast, that's where the breakfasts were cooked and often the dining room was. All this creates this kind of elaborate architectural design, which makes the world even more complicated. He also uses light and shadow wonderfully. He has the boy run out after the Mrs. Baines dies or falls down the staircases through the streets, through a kind of film noir street, cobblestone, wet street, like in The Third Man, where he runs into a policeman and shot with a kind of tracking camera or watching the boy run through the streets, where there's a wonderful play of light and shadow, which is another Reed signature aspect of Reed's style, and it's just shot wonderfully. Just as the ordinary locations of the pub and the cafe of Belgravia, this essentially wealthy area, though I know the story takes place in Pimlico, so it's not an embassy in the story originally. But he's using Green Park, all these kind of beautiful locations, lush locations, just beautifully. And it's just the broken plant, the landing. One has to understand the looking through windows, the observing through windows. Usually used for to construct a world of alienation and separation, and he does it extremely well. It's all just shot wonderfully. The overhead shots, the low angle shots, the shooting from different camera angles, all I think exquisitely chosen and extremely well cut. A lot of fairly rapid cutting. Reed was always known for his editing.
Right.
And so the movie does leave an indelible set of images. When you had me talk about it again, I'd seen it a few times in the past, and what I remembered most really was what it looked like.
Okay. I think that's one of the things we're going to take away from this film is this distinctive look that comes out of the British tradition of quality, particularly in the hands of the masters like Carol Reed and David Lean. We've come to the end of our 30 minutes, Lenny. Yeah, I know, it's always amazing. If you'd like more information about City Cinematheque, please drop us a line. Drop it to City Cinematheque, CUNY TV, 25 West 43rd Street, Suite 1220, New York, New York, 10036. Let me give you that information again. City Cinematheque, CUNY TV, 25 West 43rd Street, Suite 1220, New York, New York, 10036. Lenny, always a pleasure having you here. The 30 minutes is cut as rapidly as a Carol Reed film, and look forward to, as always, having you back to talk about the British tradition of quality or whatever comes our way. And as always, I hope that our thought and discussion here lead you to thought and discussion at home that you enjoy. Please join us again on City Cinematheque.